There was a time in America long before independence when a short man, lame in one leg, with a piercing gaze and suntanned skin, he ventured into the untamed geography of the New World to challenge the authority of the King of Spain himself. Wherever he went, he imposed a regime of violence so brutal that it paralyzed entire populations with terror. He carried no other banner than his own name, no other purpose than to amass wealth, and no other method than relentless savagery against human dignity. His ferocity earned him the nickname of the Tyrant and the Madman, but history remembers him by a name that still evokes horrific tales of abuse. We are talking about Lope de Aguirre, the man who, in his quest for power, covered the continent with a trail of blood and fear, from the vast Amazon jungles to Venezuela's stormy coasts. Join us today to learn the story of Lope de Aguirre, a soldier whose path left destroyed villages, executed authorities, and entire families plunged into mourning. My name is Alejandro Andrade. This is the New Encyclopedia. And before we start today's story, I want to invite you to support our channel. If you like our content, subscribe, give this video a like, turn on the notification bell, and share it with those who enjoy learning about history. I also invite you to follow us on Instagram, where we share exclusive content and previews of new documentaries. And finally, you can leave us your opinions and thoughts in the comments section. We always read your comments and take your suggestions into account for future research. And now, without further ado, let's begin today's story. The repertoire of mysteries surrounding the life of this irascible man begins with the date of his birth. Some historians point out that Lope de Aguirre came into this world sometime between the years 1511 and 1516. Although the most commonly cited date of his birth is November 8, 1510, in the lordship of Oñate, in the province of Guipúzcoa, in the Kingdom of Castile, Aguirre was born into a family of Spanish hidalgos. That is to say, he came from the lowest-ranking nobles within the Spanish nobility, who were traditionally squires and knights devoted to the service of the king. This social group had the particularity of generally being poor and lacking in goods and property, despite being part of the nobility. Therefore, it is doubtful whether Aguirre received any education during his, because the hidalgos, for the most part, did not enjoy much economic comfort or great wealth in the Iberian Peninsula. After the year 1492, many of them embarked on the unknown adventure of conquering the New World. This action began to be seen by the Spanish as a way to improve their quality of life and rise socially, because the conquerors could receive economic and political benefits in the provinces they settled, as well as new noble titles granted by the king. The New World was the term used by the Spanish and later by all of Europe to describe the then unknown American continent, which had been discovered by the Genoese admiral Christopher Columbus on October 12, 1492. After the discovery and the spreading of the news, the Spanish took up the banner of conquest and colonization of the New World. And so they began the work of founding cities, towns, and ports. And they began subjugating, sometimes peacefully and other times violently, the various native populations that lived throughout the American continent. They also brought their Catholic religion, their language, and their institutions, and beginning the process of cultural and blood mixing that, centuries later, would shape the different American nationalities. In this sense, by the year 1524, the Spanish had already founded a large number of cities and settlements of great strategic importance, such as the island of La Española, known today as the Dominican Republic, Veracruz, Mexico City, and Santiago de Guatemala in Central America, and on the South American side, Cumaná and Nueva Cádiz in what is now Venezuela, and Santa María la Antigua del Darién in what is now Panama. However, very soon, another territory comes into play that will be of great importance in the years to come, not only for the life of the Spanish Empire, but also for Lope de Aguirre himself. And that is the territory of what was then the Inca Empire, located mainly along the Andes mountain range of South America. At the time of its conquest, the Inca Empire was characterized by a series of outstanding features in every sense. First of all, it was a centralized and monarchical state ruled by the Inca, who was considered the son of the god Inti, that is, the sun, with absolute authority. Above all, the empire, which had its capital in the important and wealthy city of Cusco. Inca society was hierarchical, led by the Inca warrior and political nobility, with curazas or local chiefs below them, and the large mass of workers called tunrunas, who supported the system with their labor. Along with all this brilliant political organization and civilization, there was a fundamental aspect of the Inca Empire that would be decisive in attracting the conquerors. It was the abundant identity of the English, an immense wealth that was reflected above all in architectural works, sculptures, and temples built in praise of their mythological gods. Thus, this picture of remarkable organization and wealth of the Incas is what the conquerors found in the year 1524. Led by Captain Francisco Pizarro and his partner Diego de Almagro. Those who hear from Panama spread rumors about a land to the south with large populations and abundant riches. In this context, the long conquest of the Inca Empire begins, which will take several years to complete and deserves a separate video. The fact is that Francisco de Pizarro, with the discoveries made during the initial contacts with the Incas, returns to Spain in 1528 to meet with the then King Charles V. He must be a drug dealer. Adrian arriving with Janusz. He created the Ciscatrita and the last Abacatic expedition. Tells that Oyo sent to by Aguirre, motivated by the news of extraordinary riches brought by Pizarro to the Iberian Peninsula. He decides to join an expedition with about 250 men under the command of Rodrigo de Buran, going to Peru between the years 1536 and 1537. In this way, the journey of Lope de Aguirre in the new continent begins. At the start of this adventure, Aguirre was under 30 and, as far as was known, had no evil about him. Although all of this was about to change radically, when Aguirre arrives in Peru, our protagonist faces this situation. The Spanish had already completely subdued the most important cities of the Inca Empire after executing the then Emperor Atahualpa in July 1533. After this decisive event, in November of that same year, Francisco de Pizarro, who held all the power in Peru, entered Cusco in triumph and officially surrendered it, along with the entire Inca Empire. However, after this event, disputes soon began between Pizarro, his associate Diego de Almagro, his family, and the main captains of the conquest, since each one, aside from personal envy, wanted more power over the prized territory of Peru. In the midst of these disputes, intrigues, and shifting alliances, Aguirre would be caught as a reluctant witness to war. With Pizarro as mayor, rejection became a common currency. In 1534, Charles V granted Almagro the governorship of New Toledo, which led to a conflict with Francisco Pizarro over jurisdiction of Cusco. This disagreement led to the First Civil War between conquistadors, which ended with the execution of Almagro in 1538 and later with the assassination of Pizarro in 1541. Subsequently, Diego de Almagro the Younger proclaimed himself governor, but the Spanish crown sent Cristobal Vaca de Castro to restore order. Returning to Aguirre, this character, who was experiencing these events as a simple soldier, joined the army of Vaca de Castro, who defeated Almagro the Younger in 1542. That same year, Emperor Charles V proclaimed the so-called New Laws, in which he banned the hereditary nature of the encomiendas. What was the title of production? In which a conqueror, as a reward for his services, was given a certain number of subjugated Indians to work the land. Furthermore, through these new laws, the Viceroyalty of Peru and the Royal Audience of Lima were formally established, with the first Viceroy, Blasco Núñez Vela. However, the conquerors quickly show widespread discontent and begin to demand the abolition of the new laws, mainly because of the reduction of their encomiendas. After these events, the conquerors gather an army led by Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of the late Francisco, and begin the so-called Second Civil War of the Conquerors. 1544, in which Aguirre will serve on the side loyal to the new laws of Charles V. Eventually, Aguirre begins to serve under the command of Captain Melchor Verdugo, moving to fight against the opponents of the new laws in Panama, Nicaragua, and Honduras, until the crown sends Pedro de Gasca with the mission to stop the enforcement of the laws in all these territories and grant pardons to the rebels. Hoping to calm the intense violence unleashed by the power struggles, Aguirre tries to join Gasca's army in Panama, but it seems he refuses to accept him. This suggests that Aguirre's long history of violence had already begun to grow during these wars. Around this time, Aguirre, although originally loyal to the crown, begins to feel great resentment toward it, since he believes the crown was taking all the glory. Meanwhile, the soldiers loyal to the king, who endured countless hardships and miseries during the conquest, were barely rewarded for their efforts. Finally, Gasca's army manages to quell the opposition against the new laws through pardons, and he also manages to cause the desertion of what remained of Gonzalo Pizarro's army, the initiator of the Second Civil War among the conquistadors, who was executed shortly after in 1548. Lopez de Aguirre first settles in Cusco, and shortly after in the prosperous city of La Plata, in what is now Bolivia. It was there that his name became linked to a bloody episode, the murder of the city's magistrate, a crime attributed to the encomendero Sebastián de Castilla, in which Aguirre was involved. When the plot was discovered, Aguirre fled hastily to avoid the execution that awaited the leaders of the uprising. His salvation comes unexpectedly. A royal pardon was offered to those who joined the loyalist side to suppress the rebellion of Captain Francisco Hernández Girón, who had once again risen up against the new laws in Cusco. Aguirre accepted the pardon, and in May 1554, during the battle, he receives 2 gunshots in his right leg. The wounds were so severe that they left him with a pronounced limp that would stay with him for the rest of his days, becoming one of the physical traits most remembered by his contemporaries after nearly 2 decades of conflicts over the new continent. Lope de Aguirre, already close to 50 years old, was the living image of a veteran consumed by war. A man of short stature, hunched over, lame in one leg, and with a face that the chronicles mercilessly describe as unattractive. His economic and social situation was deplorable, the result of continuous civil wars, He had no money or property and was expelled from every city he arrived in because of his criminal, quarrelsome, and disruptive behavior. The bitterness of life had hardened him and filled him with hatred, both toward his compatriots and against the royal authorities of Peru. Among the soldiers who shared his misery, his reputation spread by word of mouth. Everyone knew him as Aguirre, the madman. Several researchers have suggested that Aguirre, like many other conquerors of his time, may have fallen into a form of mental derangement as a result of the sudden change of environment, the excesses of the conquest, and the endless civil wars. The Venezuelan sociologist Pedro Manuel Arcaya would describe this phenomenon as a moral regression toward man's primitive instincts. Instincts that, according to some, still beat deep within every civilized human being. And yet, it was precisely at this stage when, because of his age and his reputation as Aguirre the madman, little could be expected of him. He thus begins to take the first steps in the chain of events that would immortalize him in history as a ruthless man. Throughout the conquest, there were many stories about marvelous places whose existence was revealed to the conquerors by the natives themselves. They were always colossal cities, overflowing with unimaginable riches, but conveniently located in distant and hard-to-reach places. Of all those myths, none became as famous as El Dorado, a city, it was said, made of gold or possessing immense reserves of metal and ruled by an indigenous monarch of legendary power. Its location, shrouded in mystery, was somewhere deep in the jungles of what was then called Tierra Firme, the name given at the time to the territories that today correspond to Venezuela and Colombia. The myth spread among the conquerors as a tangible promise, a reward meant only for the boldest and most daring soldiers. On the other hand, there was also the myth of the so-called Land of Omagua, inhabited by the tribe of the same name, which had already been contacted by the Captain General of Venezuela, Felipe de Utre, in the upper Amazon, during an expedition that ended in 1545 in search of the mythical city of El Dorado. This resulted in the confusing syncretism of El Dorado and Omagua being merged into a single idea. During the already narrated Second Civil War, natives from what is now Brazilian territory bordering Peru had made reports to the Spaniards about the land of Omagua, which aroused quite a bit of greed among them. Years later, in 1559, the new viceroy Antonio Hurtado de Mendoza appointed Captain Pedro de Urzua as governor for the discovery of both Omagua and El Dorado. Although there is no indication that the viceroy believed in the myth, the truth is that by doing this, he managed to kill two birds with one stone. He satisfied the demand for an expedition to those lands, and on the other hand, he sent away hundreds of impoverished and resentful soldiers from the civil wars, who, like Aguirre, shocked and overran the cities with crimes and mutinies. But what no one imagined was that this expedition would forever alter the fate of all its members, in a way as unexpected as it was irreversible. The expedition departed from Topozana, Peru, in September 1560, after months of tough preparations and many setbacks, such as lack of funds, threats of desertion, even the murder of a lieutenant, Pedro de Urzua. He had also been warned that among his ranks were soldiers with dangerous tempers and bloody pasts. The expedition was made up of about 300 to 400 Spaniards, several of whom were forcibly enlisted, between 20 and 30 enslaved black people, and between 300 and 600 indigenous people, among whom there were several serving as guides for the explosive explorers. In the intricate geography of the Amazon, all these men with different ambitions venture into one of the continent's most relentless landscapes. Ahead of them awaited dense, almost impenetrable jungles, powerful rivers with treacherous currents, suffocating swamps, and a stifling climate that alternated between torrential rains and scorching heat. Every step into the Amazon would be a move toward the unknown, a world where the dense vegetation hid invisible dangers and where the horizon disappeared into an endless green labyrinth. The only thing that kept those soldiers going, forcing them to venture for months among such deadly threats, it was the firm certainty that at some point along the way they would come across a treasure of incalculable value. Among those soldiers was Lope de Aguirre, who, however, was not entirely convinced about the existence of El Dorado. His reputation, built on violent acts, made him impossible to overlook. Among his companions was his young daughter Elvira, who was an unusual presence in such a risky venture. As the weeks went by, the expedition first advanced along the Marañón River, then the Ucayali, and finally the mighty Amazon River, until they stopped to rest at the place known as Machifaro. Expedition Captain Pedro de Urzúa traveled with his lover, Inés de Atienza, a mestiza whose beauty arouses suspicion, envy, and dark desires among some members of the group. This intensified the atmosphere, already full of suspicion and ambition. The distances were endless, and the landscape was a green hell that seemed to have no end. Food was beginning to run out, and diseases were bringing men down, leaving them lying on the ground. The longed-for El Dorado still hadn't appeared, and with it, the last hopes that such a place existed were fading away. That physical and moral exhaustion became the perfect breeding ground for some soldiers, already inclined to insubordination, to plot a conspiracy to desert and return to Peru with the boats. But Aguirre, always bolder and more dangerous than the rest, gives a sinister twist to the intrigue. Instead of fleeing, he proposed assassinating Governor Pedro de Urzúa and putting Lieutenant General Fernando de Guzman in his place. In the early morning of January 1, 1561, Aguirre and 15 of his men attacked Urzúa, stabbing him 40 times while he was resting surrounded by his trusted men. After his death, the rebels took over the expedition. The positions were immediately distributed among them, and Aguirre was given the post of field master. Immediately afterward, a document was drafted to justify the mutiny. Although Aguirre himself knew from the very first moment that there was no legitimate excuse for that murder, which represented an unforgivable offense against the king's authority, Aguirre, he shouts to warn his companions with his deep voice and fiery gaze that no matter how many services they rendered to the king in that endless jungle, once what happened to Pedro de Urzúa was known, the crown would send men to hunt them like animals and take them to the gallows. Therefore, there was no possible redemption, and the only option left was to move forward with the rebellion. Then, with a tone that wavered between threat and promise, he presented them with his alternative, not to return meekly, but to go back to Peru with iron and fire and seize power by force. The proposal at first chilled the blood of many and was met with rejection, but desperation and the spell of ambition eventually broke the wills of those men trapped in the jungle, and one by one they agreed to follow Aguirre in his ambitious military venture. Thus was born the feared rebellion of the Marañones. In this way, in the murky waters of the Amazon, the expedition ceases to be a quest for El Dorado and becomes a tribunal of death ruled by the will of a single man. Aguirre, always alert and hand near his sword, eliminated them one by one. Those who dared to challenge him, and sometimes even those who did not. A single gesture, a misunderstood word, or simply the weight of his suspicions was enough for a companion to be thrown dead into the river or pierced by steel. He went so far as to forbid whispering, convinced that any conversation he couldn't hear was a conspiracy against his life. The atmosphere on the boats became thick with fear, and every night the murmur of the river's current. It seemed to foreshadow that at any moment a heart-wrenching scream of agony and pain would break the darkness, announcing that another member of the expedition would not see the dawn. It is during this rebellion that one of the most curious episodes in all of American history takes place. The proclamation of an independent state in rebellion against the authority of then King Felipe II. According to historian Emiliano Hodge, the most likely scenario is that this episode happened in the following way. Lope de Aguirre assembled. After ending the life of Captain Ursua, he suggests that the Marañones formally elect Fernando de Guzman as Captain General of the expedition, saying that everyone was free to withdraw or to follow Guzman in a state of war to Peru. But if they chose to follow Guzman, the soldiers had to sign a mysterious blank document, something that only 186 out of the nearly 270 involved actually did. After this, Aguirre filled in this blank document with a text written in his own handwriting, where he claimed that by renouncing the kingdoms of Spain and in retaliation for the mistreatment and lack of gratitude from the crown towards the conquistadors, the Marañones swore to wage war against King Felipe II to take his territories in America. In the name of Fernando de Guzman, now arbitrarily and absurdly made Prince of Peru, Chile, and Tierra Firme. On paper, Fernando de Guzman held the title of captain of the expedition, but in practice, from that moment on, it was Lope de Aguirre who, with his relentless gaze and the subordination of numerous men, controlled the fate of every person on the expedition. Under his shadow, the authority of his supposed king, Fernando de Guzman, becomes a useless ornament. Life or death depended entirely on his unpredictable, irritable will. This would, in fact, be the first declaration of an independent Hispanic American state, an event that would not be repeated until the beginning of the independence movements, several centuries later. Now Aguirre had the plan to leave the interior of Peru for the sea, for the ocean, to set sail for Panama, where, according to the plan, he would raise a rebel fleet with which he would invade Peru. Immediately after Holy Week of 1561, they arrived at a place on the northern coast of Peru, which would later be known as La Matanza, because there Aguirre would have the lover of the late Ursua killed, along with some captains and Prince Guzman himself, claiming that he was a threat to the good of the expedition, because all his trusted men were simply traitors to the cause. In this bloody way, Lope de Aguirre rises as the sole and undisputed strong leader of the Marañón group, according to the chronicles of the time. He consolidated his seizure of power by disarming and placing the soldiers under surveillance, forbidding them from speaking in low voices, and forcing them to report all their movements. And so, already quite deranged, unable to sleep at night and fully armed at all times, the now called tyrant Aguirre would continue the journey, executing soldiers along the way for any small inconvenience, throwing their bodies into the unfathomable surface of the water. Shortly after consolidating his control over the expedition in the Amazon, Aguirre and his men descended the great Amazon River to its mouth in northern Brazil, then skirted the coast of Guyana and Trinidad. On July 21, 1561, after having endured several days of hunger and thirst on the ocean, the expedition lands in the governorate of Margarita Island, located to the northeast of present-day Venezuela. Since then, the beach where he set foot has been known as Playa El Tirano, in memory of this figure's passage through that territory. Upon learning that the newcomers were Spanish, The island's officials went out to receive them, however, ignoring the suspicious behavior of Aguirre's men and blindly trusting in the goodwill of the strangers. They approach them without the protection of any army and end up being captured by Lope de Aguirre's band of criminals. They also take over the city they had arrived at, which was called Puerto del Espíritu Santo, located in what is now the city of Porlamar. There, they loot the city's treasury and spread terror among the inhabitants. Through some soldiers from the island who had joined his expedition, Lope de Aguirre learns that a friar named Francisco de Montesinos was sailing along the nearby coast, dedicating himself to evangelizing and preaching aboard a well-armed ship. Seeing it as a valuable prize, he decides to seize the ship and sends men to carry out the mission. But these men, either afraid or resentful toward Aguirre, desert along the way and rush to warn the friar about what was happening. Upon learning of the betrayal, Aguirre cannot contain himself. He writes a letter addressed to Montesinos in which, besides implicating the Marañones in various crimes, he openly proclaims his intention to conquer Peru as retribution and revenge for the hardships and sacrifices of the conquistadors. Friar Montesinos decides to warn the ports of the neighboring government of Venezuela about Aguirre's presence, and also sends word to the city of Santo Domingo, where the royal audience of Santo Domingo was located, which at that time served as the highest judicial and governmental authority in the Spanish Caribbean. In Santo Domingo, the crown officials warn all the ports in the region. At the same time, a fleet of 3 ships and 150 men is assembled to fight the Marañones, using the already tried strategy of causing desertions through pardons. The newly started rebellion of Aguirre was beginning to be surrounded by the naval power of Spain. Meanwhile, on Aguirre Island of Margarita, according to historian José Gil Fortul, Lope de Aguirre had violently ended the life of Governor Juan Sarmiento de Villadandro, along with that of a mayor, a councilman, a constable, 2 leading ladies, and several other Spaniards. Those crimes, far from consolidating his power, accelerated the breakdown of his followers, one after another. The men who still followed him from the intricate geography of the Amazon began to desert once they reached the mainland. Captain Francisco Fajardo, the famous mestizo conquistador who had come from Venezuela with the mission to put an end to the tyrant, was advancing to hunt him down. These ongoing difficulties forced Lope de Aguirre to leave Margarita with a new plan: to make his way by land through the province of Venezuela, to pass through New Granada and Popayan, and to reach Peru on foot, where he planned to seize absolute power over South America. Thus began Aguirre's raids through the Venezuelan mainland, a territory that would become the grave of the expedition. The then governor of Venezuela, Pablo Collado, had already been informed of Aguirre's rebellion by a letter from Friar Montesinos. The governor, who is described as a faint-hearted man according to some records from the time, had not bothered to prepare the province's army for Aguirre's eventual arrival. When the residents of the coastal city of Borborata spotted Aguirre's ship approaching on September 7th, they could barely hide in the mountains with their families. When this news reached the interior of the governorate, Captain Gutierrez de la Peña asked the governor what should be done. The governor's response was that they should only flee westward as Aguirre advanced further into the country. However, the next day, Gutierrez de la Peña was appointed Captain General, taking charge of preparing the resistance against. The center of operations would be in the city of Barquisimeto, with Gutierrez de la Peña as the commander of the resistance. The fieldmaster, Diego Garcia de Paredes, who had founded the city of Trujillo in Venezuela, and Captain Pedro Bravo de Molina. In addition, Several soldiers from other cities in the country, such as Valencia, Trujillo, Nirgua, and Mérida, joined as well. There were a total of 100 or 150 men with only 6 arquebuses and very crude spears and armor. Meanwhile, on his side, Aguirre had about 200 Marañones, most of them armed to the teeth with swords, daggers, and arquebuses. After passing through a deserted Borborata, the tyrant arrived at the city of Valencia, which was in the same condition, deserted and abandoned by its inhabitants. In Valencia, Aguirre writes his famous letter to King Philip II, where he expresses the same ideas as in his previous proclamation and signs as Lope de Aguirre, the pilgrim. In this letter, with a petulant and reproachful tone at the same time, he writes the following: Look, Spanish king, do not be ungrateful to your vassals. For when your father, the emperor, was in the kingdoms of Castile without any trouble, they gave you, at the cost of their blood, as many kingdoms and dominions as you have in these lands. And look, sir, you cannot claim the title of just king over any interests in these lands where you risk nothing, unless those who worked in these lands are rewarded first. Aguirre leaves Valencia on October 15 and arrives in Barquisimeto 7 days later, that is on October 22 in Barquisimeto. Many soldiers begin to desert him, while he is harassed in the rear by Governor Gutierrez's troops who had set up their headquarters near the city. However, the greatest disappointment for Aguirre was finding documents granting pardons to deserters distributed among the houses of Barquisimeto. This caused more and more Marañones to desert and join the troops opposing Aguirre. On October 24th, seeing that all his soldiers are slipping away, Aguirre gives a speech in which he begs them not to desert, pleading the following: For the love of God, I beg you not to let us be defeated by these people from Cazabe and Arepas. And if you plan to go over to the king's side, let it be in Peru. So, knowing he doesn't have much left to do, the next day, October 27th, Aguirre gets ready to march, but no one in his army wants to leave. The soldiers, one by one, start going over to the enemy barracks of Gutierrez, until Aguirre is left alone with his daughter, a maid, and a soldier in a house in the city. Lope de Aguirre, in a completely gruesome and ruthless act, stabs his daughter to death, saying that he did it so she wouldn't be called the daughter of a traitor or harassed by his enemies. Then 2 former Marañones, Custodio Hernandez and Juan Guerrero, come by and arrest him. When Master Garcia de Paredes passes by, Aguirre will ask to be given the time stipulated by law to declare the crimes of the Marañones. 2 of them immediately shoot him twice with an arquebus, killing him on the spot. Another one cuts off his head and gives it to Governor Gutierrez, who was just arriving at the scene. Aguirre's dismembered body is displayed in plazas across several Venezuelan cities. The captains who ended his life are rewarded for their services with noble titles, positions, and other honors. Of the Marañón rebels who were initially pardoned, most would be pursued, imprisoned, or executed, while others would even participate in new conquests and forces. And on the other hand, the governor of Venezuela himself, Pablo Collado, is sentenced to death for his inaction in the face of the imminent arrival of Lope de Aguirre on the mainland. Thus ends the turbulent life of Lope de Aguirre, and with it, the rebellion of the Marañones that shook an entire continent for months. The biography of Lope de Aguirre. More than just the story of one man, it is a story that represents the complexity of the conquest process, the abandonment of the Spanish homeland, and the conquest of new territories. The sacrifices, the passions, the suspicions, and of course, the madness that developed along the way. At the same time, Aguirre's life reveals the psyche of the characters who carried out the conquest. All men of their turbulent era, some illustrious and true gentlemen, others dark, evil, and full of greed. The rebellion of Lope de Aguirre and his attempt to establish a kingdom of Peru governed by the conquistadors themselves and not by the King of Spain. It has no lasting impact on the political order of Spanish America, which would remain loyal to the Spanish crown for more than 2 centuries. However, there is no doubt that this bloody episode remains one of the most unique and surprising in the history of the American continent, forged after the encounter of 2 different worlds. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave us a like, subscribe, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and share it with your friends through social networks like WhatsApp or Facebook. This way, you help us a lot to reach new people and continue producing this material. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for following and supporting us, and we'll see you next time.